And then more general advice is something that Woody Allen once said, which is 80% of success in life is showing up.
Wow.
So that means that notwithstanding whatever challenges you may face in life, you need to develop the personal and professional resilience to always show up. It's like in sports, there are certain athletes that just keep showing up. And one of the reasons I wear the kippah is not only to identify myself very clearly, not because I'm the most religious Jew, but to identify myself clearly as a Jew. But secondly, to try to remind myself that I'm accountable to something beyond myself. And I think when you are humble, when you're authentically humble, you're open to receiving feedback.
Right.
You're not closed.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Jewish Professionals Podcast, the JP Podcast. I'm Hillel Bainach.
And I'm Benjamin Winters, and we're students at Yeshiva University, just looking for some advice.
Our aim is to bring to you Jewish professionals from every industry to learn from their successes and failures, how they grew in their career and Jewish identity, and made a Kiddush Hashem along the way.
We hope you can apply what you learned through the lessons to your own life as they pass the torch to us, the next generation. We can't wait to go along this journey with you. This is the Jewish Professionals Podcast.
Woo! Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Jewish Professionals Podcast, the JP Podcast, the first Sunday edition.
I know, I'm really excited, and we have a very special guest here joining us, and he's in New York for a very special reason, a Broadway show.
A birthday, too.
A birthday, too. Maybe before we get to the guest himself, could you tell us what brought you to New York and what show you're watching?
Oh, okay. My name's Mitch Julis, alternative asset manager and proud board member at Yeshiva University. I'm really delighted to be here today. Thank you to you guys, Hillel and Ben.
Yeah.
So I'm originally from New York. I was born in 1955, lived 10 years in the Bronx, in the northeast part of the Bronx. My parents were teachers in the New York City school system. Ultimately, my father was an administrator in the school system, and my mom worked with special services with challenged kids as a speech pathologist. We moved from the Bronx in 1965 up to Rockland County, so we lived in Spring Valley. I went to school there in Muncie. So I'm very well acquainted with New York, through the ups and downs of New York. And notwithstanding all the challenges that New York has gone through over the years, Broadway has been a singularly constant element of life in New York, even during the worst of times. And in our household, Broadway was always present. My mom used to play all the albums from the key shows of that time, My Fair Lady, Camelot, West Side Story, and Oliver, etc. And so I grew up with that. And in fact, when the summers that we went up to Copake Lake, where there was a camp, my parents were counselors so that my brother and I could go to camp for free. And my mother one year was the dramatics counselor.
Oh my gosh.
And she put on 6 plays, including the big production, The King and I. That's no easy task. That was, I think, 1962 or 63.
Especially at camp, that could be a tough audience. People need to be entertained.
Well, she did a great job. And so my mom celebrated her 95th birthday on Friday, on Shabbat. So I came in for that. And today, after we do this podcast, we're going to Broadway to see Chicago.
Wow.
So that, there's a variety of other reasons I'm here to do your podcast. And Rabbi Soloveitchik's son is getting married tomorrow night, Monday. So a variety of reasons. But there's always a reason to come back to New York. New York is such a vibrant place, notwithstanding all its challenges. We're lucky enough the day of this podcast to finally get some sunshine.
Yes.
It's beautiful. You came on the right week.
Yeah.
That's amazing. It's funny, but just before we get into it, I want to say, as a fellow, kid who grew up with the theater in mind, my parents used to take us to these plays.
Kennedy Arts Center?
Yeah, Kennedy Arts I'm from DC originally, and always in the car as I was younger, it was an all-out brawl in the back seat, like on our way there after Shabbat, and we're like, we don't want to go, I'm not in. And then the second we'd get there,
my dad would be like, okay, we're turning the car around. You guys are too difficult. And then all of us would be like, no, we want to go. We want to go. No, we want to go.
He knew what he was doing.
And then at the end of the show, every single time we're like, when are we going next? When are we going next?
Absolutely.
So I appreciate the
My
theater.
my son Elliot was like that for a while. He didn't see the value of going to the Broadway shows, but I think he's changed over the years as he's gotten older.
Yeah.
So the last thing I wanted to say, just obviously you guys are better dressed than I am, but I apologize. Today has been, even on a Sunday, a rather busy day. To rush up here from where I was, I didn't have really a chance to change. So I think while I'm dressed informally, I think you can tell from both this medallion, which for the hostages, and the pin, where is it? Over on this side? Yeah. And also the jacket is from the memorial exhibition that was done for
The Noah Festival.
the Noah Festival.
Right.
And the motto, "We will dance again." So you could see this is a jacket from that. So notwithstanding the informality, it's not a lack of respect for you guys and what you're trying to do here.
No, I
it's-
appreciate it.
I think it's always important to, point to these things that are obviously values that we all stand for. And I think it's special that you came into that today. And going back a little bit to what you mentioned growing up in New York, what was that like? And what was your first experiences of finance? Did you take school seriously? Things of that nature.
Well, New York, in terms of my first memories, late 50s, early 60s, New York back then was, I would say, a very accessible place in the sense that as a lower middle class family, the way it worked was the following. We lived in pre-war housing, pre-World War II housing, because when the GIs came back, of which my father and my uncles were GIs in World War II, when they came back, there was a housing shortage because most of the capital investment was made in, the war effort. So there was a lack of housing. As a matter of fact, in Long Island, Levittown is really a post-World War II development. And also Donald Trump's father took advantage of the explosion in demand for housing that came when the GIs came back, and then the baby boom, of which I'm part of that generation. So it was very difficult to find housing after World War II. So we were lucky enough to live in pre-war housing. It was all no elevator. So we lived on the 4th floor. And my parents, you imagine schlepping up a baby carriage.
Right.
And the
Or
groceries.
just routine. I was thinking that routine groceries.
That's
Right.
brutal.
And the way it worked was we were 2 blocks away from the Bronx Zoo, and we lived right next to the Greek side of my family, the Romanio Greek side of the family. We lived right next door. So when my parents went to work, my Greek grandparents would take care of me and my brother. And on very good days, we'd be, when the weather was right, go to the Bronx Zoo all the time. So we had that available to us.
What's your favorite animal?
That's a good question.
It's got to be the giraffe now.
Let's see. I just recently, we went to Africa. And so we were, I think there's nothing like being near a pride alliance. It's quite intimidating, actually. But back then in the Bronx Zoo, it was obviously the monkey house,
Yeah.
which I don't think they would do in today's zoos. It was just an enclosed thing,
Wow.
not a good situation. So we had the Bronx Zoo, and then we had all the movie theaters at the time, because you have to remember back then there was only broadcast channels, and there weren't that many of them. Back in New York, which had the most channels, it was just, I think, maybe eight main channels. And so movies was still a very important, accessible form of entertainment. And my grandfather, when he was retired from being in the garment workers union in the industry, he would take the long walk with me and what seemed like a long walk to Tremont Avenue, go to the movie theaters. So love of movies came from that.
Oh, nice.
So the other thing was that my mother originally came from Manhattan. Her family had a walk-up building with the grocery store that they ran on 2nd Avenue opposite Kips Bay. So we would take the train, which was only about 5 blocks away, all the time. So you felt safe enough for a young woman with 2 young kids, very young kids, to be able to go on a train and have access to all that Manhattan had to offer. So when you put it together and then we had the Italian neighborhood nearby, Fordham University, and the Botanical Gardens. So Northeast Bronx was really a good place to grow up. In our building, it was like a sitcom of diversity. I guess that's the term you would use today. On the top floor were the O'Connors, and of course, he was a cop. A lot of Irish were in that area. On the 4th floor were the Catanzaros. They were a Polish Catholic family. Then we had a lot of Jews who lived in the building. So it was a real mix. So we were exposed at an early age to a variety of different cultures. Our the guy who took care of the building was, he had 8 kids. He was from Ireland. It was
Wow. Just a melting
It was
pot.
a melting pot within that building.
How did you go from how did you go from there, from that childhood? You're obviously getting great world experience to Princeton.
Well, my point was just that the city was accessible, so you could use mass transportation.
Right. Yeah.
You didn't feel, unlike today, that it was dangerous to do so. And then ultimately, we moved from that pre-war building to what was called Mitchell-Lama Housing, which was a public-private partnership that made affordable housing available. That was between Gun Hill Road and Allerton Avenue, right across from Marshallou Park. Again, only a few blocks away from the L, what we call the L here, the elevated part of the subway system. So you could grow up in New York, lower middle class family, and have a very good life.
Right.
There was something called, when my parents didn't work during the summer, there was something called Shore Haven, which was an accessible swim club, tennis racket club that was near Throgsnet Bridge.
Oh my God. I mean, all these names are seared into your memory.
And then the last thing,
Amazing.
When my mom decided to move out of the city, which was a tough decision, to Rockland County, the thing that made that possible, because my father would have to commute every day into the Bronx, was the fact that during the Eisenhower administration, the highway system was developed. And so we had the New York State Thruway, what is now called the Mario Cuomo Bridge. Back then it was called the Tappan Zee Bridge, and the Palisades Interstate Parkway leading to the George Washington Bridge. So all that is very different from today, because one of the major economic social challenges that is trying to be addressed by our leadership different ways is why things have evolved such that it's very difficult for lower middle class families to have the same quality of life that I was exposed to, where you could go to public school and still get a good education. You could walk to school and didn't have to worry about, some of the things you have to worry about today.
Right.
And one of the reasons that when those things started to deteriorate in the city, there was a mass migration out of the city to the burbs, to Long Island, Westchester, Rockland County.
The burbs, I like that.
The suburbs, to New Jersey. And that created a hollowing out of New York City during the 70s, during the worst of times.
How did you get to Princeton?
Well, Princeton, one of the benefits of moving to Rockland County was during the late 60s and the 70s, the public school system in Rockland County benefited from all the outflow of educational professionals from New York City.
Mass migration.
So it's not just people looking for a better life. It was professionals who also wanted a better life for their kids. And so we got the benefit of amazing teachers.
That's great.
And in that school system. So you could get a really great public school education.
And you took your studies very seriously.
And part of the reason was I developed a hip disease when I was in 6th grade, so I was laid up for almost a year and a half. So I couldn't do sports other than swimming. So I focused on performing arts and academics, and I had a great study partner. Oh, actually, my cohort of friends were all pretty studious, and one particularly, Mark Lassner and I from 4th grade, We used to study together. So it makes sense to have
Wow.
a good study partner and a good family support. And so we were both, Mark and I were both lucky enough to get into Princeton in 1973. We were admitted and then started, we were class of 77. And at that time, they were taking a lot of Jews. I think under Bill Bowen, who was not Jewish, but really believed in taking more kids, including from the Jewish day schools, his Jewish percentage expanded from below, let's say 5-6% to over 20% by the time he left presidency.
That's
now it's
incredible.
back
That's
down to 8%.
Yeah, I was about to say,
So
we don't have that kind of luck today.
So we benefited from the fact that they actually, hard to say today,
Right.
given what's going on in the Ivies, they wanted Jews back then. Mark and I were roommates all 4 years,
That's amazing.
and he was of great support. And so I was able to get a very good education there. And then, I eventually cross-pollinated with one of our other roommates, Russ Hansen, who came from up Syracuse, I believe. He wanted to go to business school,
Right.
which I had no idea about.
Yeah.
My parents weren't business people. And so we ended up cross-pollinating, and we both went to joint business and law programs. He went to Stanford, and I went to Harvard.
Oh, the MBA, JD.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So
Did
he
you-
originally just wanted
Right.
to go to business school.
What was your intention? To become a lawyer?
Originally, yeah, I was obsessed with growing up during the Cold War when, we were eyeball to eyeball with the Soviet
Right.
Union. So that was my original intention, was Soviet politics, Russian studies. And then the Nixon presidency imploded before everybody's eyes.
That was Watergate,
So I
right?
got very much interested in political economy at the what was then called the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And we had to worry about going into a bomb shelter because of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh,
And,
right.
It's a crazy time.
And most of the zeitgeist of the time was, and you can see it in the movies and the books, Failsafe and other things, and Dr. Strangelove, was about blowing up the world and dealing with the menace of Red China and the Soviet Union. And so I pivoted to understanding what I call the 4 Ps: personality, politics, policy, and process. And I had the benefit of great teachers at Princeton. Fred Greenstein was my thesis advisor, and my senior thesis actually was about something that's very relevant to today, which is the strings that are attached to the federal grant programs, which
Right
means
now.
that if you're a grant recipient, you have to abide by Title IX, Title VI,
Are they
all the things today that are very we've been around for years.
are they looking at the Mitch Julius thesis to see what policy should dictate right now for all these
actually
for all these schools?
Maybe they should dust it off.
No, well, the point of the thesis was that none of these strings ever get canceled. So even Davis-Bacon wages, which was developed during the 30s, was a racist policy to import urban wage levels into rural areas
Right.
for the work progress administration programs to try to gin up the economy during the Depression. So that way black labor couldn't compete. Low cost black labor in those southern areas couldn't compete with white labor because you would force a grant recipient for a construction project to set wages based on the urban level.
Wow.
So that Davis-Bacon wages still exists today, even though its original intent was racist. So you can imagine over the years how many strings are attached to federal grant programs. So when they say that a lot of the stuff is not shovel-ready, one of the reasons is compliance. And it really is, in many ways, eventually it will be challenged under the Constitution because
I've seen that.
the way our Constitution works, even though constitutional law was my worst subject at Harvard Law, the way I understand it is the Constitution has enumerated powers and then everything else is reserved to the states. But under the spending power, if you attach all these strings, you federalize state and local law, and which upends our federal system of 50 states competing, on the base
Right.
for human, physical, and financial capital. So eventually it's going to get tested. But right now it's a source of controversy because the Trump administration is using Title VI
Right,
to go after colleges and universities
It's so funny
based
that-
on anti-Jew hate. I don't
Right.
like the term anti-Semitism. Based on discrimination against Jews and
Right.
Jew hatred and
Yeah.
et cetera. Under the Obama administration, they used Title IX to shift the burden of proof in sexual harassment cases, such that the accused had the burden of proof, arguably, as opposed to the accuser.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's not like the Trump administration is using the strings attached to grant programs for the first time.
It's been done
before.
Very interesting. And
Anyway, that little segue.
Right, that's
about-
what the thesis-
is just to give you an idea that when I decided to shift from international politics and law and policy to political economy, I really got, because of the Woodrow Wilson School being flexible, was able to get a pretty multidisciplinary exposure between Fred Greenstein, my thesis advisor, and also Uwe Reinhardt teaching accounting at Princeton in the 70s, which was really, he was kind of a maverick. He was best known as a health economist, but he taught several generations of Princetonians accounting as a language that you needed just as if you would
Right.
need any other language. And even though no department really encouraged him to do so, he felt it was his obligation to teach accounting because as a immigrant from Germany to the United States, he felt that the United States, and he said this explicitly, the United States democracy, our form of a government in our society, is based on accountability. You have to be accountable for your actions, and accounting is one of the most important things that we have to enforce accountability.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why he felt it was his civic obligation to teach accounting. And as a matter of fact, when we set up with Chris Paxson and Shirley Tillman, the president of Princeton, and the former dean Chris Paxson of the Woodrow Wilson School, the Center for Public Policy and Finance, it was a requirement for our gift that Princeton teach accounting because they weren't going to do that.
It's amazing.
And so that's now a requirement for that.
So
gift.
Was that where the transition happened? Because when you're giving me the thesis
that's
explanation,
how I got-
you sound like a legal expert. So I'm saying, where did you sort of start to go into the business world?
Well, that was really because of being exposed to, that's one of the benefits of going to college, right?
Yeah.
Is you meet other people, you get out of your bubble. And so being exposed to Russ Hansen, who wanted to go to business school, and like I said, we ended up both doing the same thing. Although, ironically enough, he ended up being a lawyer, and I ended up getting into, joining Drexel and doing the whole thing. So I ended up doing what I thought he originally intended to want to do. So it's kind of funny that way.
What was it like starting at a law firm? What was that experience?
I'll get into that in a second. So the idea of being interested in business really, and the structure of institutions really came at Princeton, and then was further developed when I went to the joint program at Harvard. Again, great teachers, great relationships. My partner, Josh Freeman, I met. He was in my section at Harvard. We know it when we were in business school. We were both in the joint program. That was the September 1978. And then we became roommates the next 2 years in Soldiers Field Park. We shared an apartment. Then we became friends, and then eventually he joined me at Drexel. And then when Drexel itself went bankrupt, we set up Canyon. So we've been friends.
You've been together for a while.
And business partners since 1978.
Wow.
That's loyalty right there.
Well, I don't know if it's loyalty as much as it is his mother, like my parents was a teacher. His father, like my father, was in World War II. His parents, when I knew Josh, didn't know him very much at all, invited me for a Rosh Hashanah dinner. So he opened up his family to me because they lived in Wayland, Mass. So I would say, there was a lot of commonality on basic values, a sense of humor, that we've always been able to use to get through any challenges that we've had to deal with, either personally or professionally. So when you have shared values like that, I think it can really allow for a relationship to last. It is pretty unique in my, in the alternative asset management business, but there are other examples. For example, David Caliber and Cliff Asness at AQR. They've been partners for a long time. So
It's amazing to see a friendship bloom into.
It's
so many different
such a
things.
theme of these people we talk to is so much of what they say is how important it is to be surrounded by motivated, ambitious.
yeah, well, for example, I think one of the things at Drexel that was very clear was that Mike Milken has had longstanding relationships with, obviously, Lowell, his brother, and also Richard Sandler, who they grew up together in Encino. So we're talking about
Yeah.
longstanding relationships. I was just talking to somebody today who has a private equity business, and he said if I had to do it all over again, I would have developed a partner earlier on in my business to be able to work. So he asked me, would you have wanted to just go solo, and do you have any regrets? And I said, not at all. I don't think we could have done for better or worse, there's no way, at least I could have done what we have done at Canyon without having the partnership with Josh Friedman.
That's amazing.
There's no way. I don't know whether Josh, could have done it by himself, perhaps, or with somebody else, but I don't think without Josh Friedman, we would have been able. I would have been able to do what I've been able to do.
Why don't we talk a little about what Canyon Partners is?
So Canyon, I guess when we first started, we would be considered a hedge fund, but I think what we think about it more broadly today is an alternative asset manager that focuses on mostly credit, although, we will do equities to the extent that they're special situations. But there are three main categories. If you look at it as a matrix, there are three asset categories that we tend to focus on. It's corporate securities, debt securities, and equities. There's real estate, both debt and equity. And then there's securitized assets, which can range from commercial mortgages, residential mortgages, auto loans, consumer loans, a whole variety. So you can imagine as a matrix on the left side, those different asset categories.
I'm picturing it.
And then on the top of the matrix, you can have all these different platforms. So the original platform was a hedge fund format where people have the right to redeem over some period of time. And then you have more locked up formats or different types of products. And then we have a CLO equity funds that I think we're on our fourth fund right now. And a CLO is a collateralized loan obligation structure where the equity fund seeds these structures where the left side of the balance sheet are leveraged loans that meet the standards of the rating agencies in terms of diversification.
Got it.
And the right side is a tiered financing of AAA securities down through the equity, where the covenants are set and the waterfall of the cash flows that are generated between the spread of the leveraged loan asset portfolio and their cost of their liabilities goes to the residual, which is the equity. So that's $11 billion of our assets right now. It's what I call more generally the combination of structural alpha with investment alpha, because the investment alpha is picking the portfolio and then trading it and upgrading it when there's disruptions in the market. That's the left side of the balance sheet. And the structural alpha is how you finance that portfolio.
Right.
And when you have a tiered financing based on covenants where you have certain degrees of separation from the what's going on in the marketplace, it gives you the staying power to be able to upgrade the portfolio during disruptive times. So that way you have a structure that supports the resiliency of the CLO fund.
Right.
And each CLO equity fund that we raise can do approximately, if you let's say each one is $500 million in assets, you put up $50 million for each one of these things as the residual equity. You can populate 8 to 10 of these things.
Right. So I guess real quick, I kind of want to hear your take on the market right now and everything that's going on.
In terms of what the market is not homogeneous, right?
Right.
So You're talking about the equity market?
I'm talking about the whole.
The equity market.
Right.
Yeah, the equity market.
Well, the equity market, there's two kinds of situations. So, I think this is emblematic of what's going on right now. So if you look at like an ETF, such as the Vanguard or
Right.
the State Street is very well known, this SPDR, SPDR, right? So that costs you about 9 bips to get a market weight. You get something that emulates the S&P 500, which is a market weighted index. So that reflects, a lot of the tech companies. At one point, NVIDIA, I think, was 6% of that thing, right? So that's down with dividends about 5.7% as of Friday. So it's come back about 10% from the low that came after so-called Liberation Day. The equal-weighted index, which is just 500 names equally weighted as opposed to market-weighted, I think is like 4.3, I think, if I remember correctly. So that represents, in many ways, the SPDR, the market-weighted one, represents what you would call the new economy, the very tech-oriented type stocks that everybody knows,
Got
right?
it.
The Magnificent Seven, whatever you want to call
Yeah.
them. If you look at Berkshire Hathaway, year to date, I believe, and I can look, we can look this up right now, right? So
Let's do it.
if you look at Berkshire Hathaway, which in many ways represents the old economy, right? The monopoly
Right.
companies,
Right.
So I believe that Berkshire Hathaway is down very little. So let's see,
Right.
Berkshire.
I mean,
is-
right before everything went down, I saw something. Actually, it was a little beforehand. I
Yeah.
saw that they invested in Domino's, like pizza, which is
it
not
wouldn't surprise me,
which is
right?
not a Mag 7. But
Well, and the Domino's actually, I remember someone telling it's one of the most highly growth companies.
all I'm saying is I saw that, and I
recent
also
history.
put it into Domino's.
If you if you had
So-
invested in Domino's like years ago, it would have been one of the highest returns you could possibly had out of a stock, I believe.
So 12/31/24, Berkshire was I'm doing this on the fly, 453.
you got to see the math prowess.
And no math prowess. I'm just going to my CNBC Pro. I'm making it. I think it's, by the way, for your viewers, and CNBC Pro is one of your best, and there's now something called CNBC Plus, but it is one of the best values. CNBC Pro gives you 24/7, either
Outlook,
live
right.
or streaming programming, plus all the content. And the CNBC Plus gives you now the analytics.
Oh, that's amazing.
Which you get on Bloomberg, but for Bloomberg it costs you, depending upon your cable access or your streaming access. So it's 530.
Wow.
So what did I say was the first?
453, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty good, right?
Yeah, that's pretty good, especially now.
So those two markets, right? You understand, right?
Right.
He sold B of A, a lot of his BA, I think he still owns, and then he sold down a lot of his Apple. He has over 350 billion of cash. He sold along the way. So you got the two markets here reflected in the price of Berkshire and the ETF, the S&P 500, even though equal weighted. So to me, what does that say? It says that maybe the tech companies overshot, which complex systems have a tendency to do. They overshoot and then they get back to some sort of mean. Or it could mean that the other companies were undervalued. Or it could mean that what Warren Buffett has built, which is an intelligently leveraged portfolio of compounder type investments, whether he owns them or he buys them, they're in the market. His structure, which the idea of an insurance company being in the alternative asset management business, that's structural alpha that he has as an insurance company supports his investment alpha.
Wow.
So you're getting intelligent leverage on the investment he makes or his team makes. Whereas in the SPDR, you'd have to use stupid leverage to get those kinds of returns, right? Because you'd have to do it on margin, which then, if it went down like it did before, you'd have to post more
Right.
collateral or you'd have to reduce, you have to sell at the wrong time. So that's an important thing that goes to, this idea of young professionals, because if you're going to get into my industry, alternative asset management, you really have to look for those firms that have been able to combine structural alpha with investment alpha.
Explain briefly what that is for people.
So structural alpha is from me, and you can look this up. There's academic discussions about it and how it's helped Berkshire's return. Structural alpha simply means the staying power, having a resilient structure that matches your investment philosophy. So if you look at what Berkshire Hathaway what Warren Buffett was able to do. Originally, he had a hedge fund. So any financial institution that manages a balance sheet as a product or as an institution has to be aware of avoiding balance sheet incongruence, right? That's what we dealt with
long-term assets with short-term liabilities.
Right. So Silicon Valley Bank and all that, right? Or the 2008 situation. So you want to have balance sheet congruence. So what was a congruent investment approach for a hedge fund where people couldn't redeem? Well, that was Ben Graham's philosophy of short duration, special situations as investments, right? When he met Charlie Munger, and this is why Warren Buffett calls him the architect of Berkshire, when he eulogized Charlie, he said he was the architect because he basically told Warren that, number one, your investment alpha should include not just Ben Graham, but really Phil Fisher, which is longer duration compounding investments in quality companies. So instead of getting, fair company at a great price, you want to get a great company at a good price.
And just hope the company just succeeds beyond expectation.
Or a great company at a fair price.
Right. And just let the great company do what it does best.
And compound. And then you want to, and he said that I think he said to Warren, he had in his portfolio when he was still a hedge fund, an investment in a bank and an investment in an insurance company. He said, get rid of the bank and invest in that insurance company. And
Got it.
Now, whether he actually told them to transform yourself into an insurance company, not clear, but I think that's the gist of it and why he's called the architect. So when you combine investment alpha with structural alpha, and you can go to the last meeting that Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, their shareholder meeting, he talks more than I think he did at other meetings about his low-cost debt in the form of his obligations to his insurance policy holders. It's long duration, cheap debt. That is his competitive advantage. So structural alpha can show up in a variety of ways. You can show up in a hedge fund, for example, where you can argue, even if I have market illiquid investments on the left side of my hedge fund balance sheet, and I have investors who could take money out over some, let's say 4 quarters after giving notice at a certain time, as long as that portfolio generates liquidity separate and apart from market conditions, and nothing is entirely separate. But for example, we always look at endogenous liquidity as a way of dealing with
what is it? What is endogenous?
Exogenous risk, and then there's endogenous risk. Endogenous risk is when you have something like the 2008 crisis, when you have something endogenous to the incentives and the structure of the financial system that causes a collapse. And an exogenous risk or shock is like COVID.
Something that's an exterior thing.
Or even then, you could say some elements of COVID were
supply chain problems.
The shock of COVID, you could say, to the extent that it was developed in a lab,
right?
Then you could say, what is it about our competition with different countries that gave rise to that kind of risk taking? Why did our institutions support that?
Right.
Kind of thing.
For anyone wanting to learn more about more of the technical stuff, I would recommend the Credit Investor Handbook. We had the luxury of preparing with it to know some of these terms, but I wanted to also dive in to just some outside advice.
But also, I'm perfectly willing to. You can share with
the presentation.
Anybody who's listening who wants my recent presentation.
I will send it out.
At Columbia Business School.
We'll put it in the link.
It's cleared our SEC compliance standards, so you can send it out.
Yeah, so I'll send it out. Or reach out, hbanash@gmail.com.
My first point was that if you want to be in this area,
Yeah.
you have to look for firms that are aware in their own way of combining structural alpha with investment alpha,
Got it.
Okay.
right? And then more general advice is something that Woody Allen once said, which is 80% of success in life is showing up.
Wow.
So that means that notwithstanding whatever challenges you may face in life, you need to develop the personal and professional resilience to always show up. It's like in sports, there are certain athletes that just keep showing up. And
You're a sports fan, Mitch?
no, I'm more, like I said, being laid up with a hip disease during key time of my life. I got
You had
I got
the
more
NBA on
into
track.
Broadway and performing arts and playing trumpet and all that stuff.
That's definitely really cool. Still, that's
But for professional advice, I would say that's a guidepost how you should sort of build yourself up to have that kind of resilience, because there's always going to be challenges.
Right.
There's the other advice I would give is something that was given to me, which is by one of the rabbis from the Aish community in Los Angeles. I think it was Rabbi Dov Heller. And he said, when you go through life, you always should, the Jewish trifecta is to always have great teachers in your life, great partners personally and professionally, and also teach, and students, to have great students. Because when you have to teach, communicate, you have to distill, and you learn a lot in that process. So I think the trifecta of continual education. So you can get formal education, and then, when you go out in the world. So that means you have to find, so what does it mean to have a great teacher, for example? Well, we had terrific, Josh and I have had great teachers both at Harvard, and I had them at Princeton, and then when we worked for Mike Milken, we were able to learn a lot, and we still learn from Mike and some of the people, obviously in the so-called Drexel Burnham diaspora out there. But you also, when you think of great teachers, not only what they bring to the table professionally, but they have their moral foundation, their value system. You have to make sure that the values that you're aligning yourself with any institution that you want to work for, are the values you've cultivated, that you're not going to sacrifice things, because that's where you can lose everything in an instant, and you're going to get tested that way. So there are plenty of companies out there that walk the talk when it comes to their mission statements and the values that they have. But foundationally, it really comes from how you were raised.
right.
How did you build the values in Canyon Partners?
Well, like I said, it came from the way I think Josh and I were raised. And we have to show that we stay away from red lines, that we don't push the limits. That may be not the way capitalism works. But, as we said, this is the kind of thinking that's kept us out of the big money for years. I mean, it's also kept us out of jail.
Yeah.
We've been SEC compliant since 1994, which is long before other hedge funds, were required under Dodd-Frank to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying we're better than anybody else. It's just that for our own edification and our own sense of peace and our own value system, we want to make sure. Look, Jews in general have to love the law. You just don't obey the law.
Right. That's in the oxygen of the Jew.
Yeah, that's right. You have to love the law. You have to
yeah.
embrace it actively. And I think that's what we try to do at Canyon. Everybody understands that. And then you have to treat people, and you're not always going to be successful at doing this. You're going to have to treat people with respect. You have to like the people that you work with, and you have to respect them. You have to be kind. I think a lot of leadership today is increasingly understanding that humility is a key component to leadership, which really comes from the notion that whatever you believe from a spiritual standpoint, that there's a higher power of something, like in Star Wars, it's the Force, or whatever it is. There's something outside yourself,
Right.
to which you are held accountable. There's that word that Professor Reinhardt, used as a foundation for teaching accounting. You are accountable to something. And one of the reasons I wear the kippah is because, not only to identify myself very clearly, not because I'm the most religious Jew, but to identify myself clearly as a Jew, But secondly, to try to remind myself that I'm accountable to something beyond myself. And I think when you are, and I'm not always successful in that, I have all the human frailties that everybody has, but I have a great partner in work, and I have a great partner at home who keep me hopefully accountable and straight. And when you're humble, when you're authentically humble, you're open to receiving feedback.
Right.
You're not closed. And when you're open to receiving feedback, particularly if you have good colleagues, like I say, teachers, partners, students.
Right.
And there's this kind of, sometimes you're the teacher, sometimes you're the student, you're the partner. Then you can learn, and then you can adapt. And it's hard to do that.
Yeah.
But that, to me, for young professionals, those are some of the guideposts. The opportunities in the alternative asset management business are really, I think, terrific for those who hustle, who are authentically, you come across as authentic. Your interest, your drive is not overweening, but it's just that you have this intellectual curiosity. Of course, you want to advance professionally, but think of it this way. There's a tremendous amount of wealth around the world. And the banks, the commercial banks, the money center banks have been increasingly constrained in their ability to intermediate that since the 2008 crisis. So that has given a tremendous opportunity to the alternative asset managers.
There's a void to fill, right?
To fill that void. So as a result, their scale has increased. And increasingly, there's this, what I call, you see it in the presentation, it's like when worlds collide and worlds divide, right? So what's the collision? It's the idea that outside the money center banks, the most balance sheet congruent institutions are alternative asset managers, particularly when they're combined with insurance companies of some form, in some way. So that's that structural alpha, investment alpha. And given the constraint of the money center banks for intermediation, and given the expanding amount of wealth, since we haven't had a world war, the capital stock of wealth around the world, even with globalization starting to reverse, but it's not going to be able to be reversed completely. That need to intermediate is huge, number one. It's also, so the opportunity in alternatives is great, therefore, good opportunity for young professionals with the right firm, right values. Secondly, demographically, it is important to be in alternatives because as you get an aging population in many of the countries north of the equator, right? Europe, Japan, you have less workers to support the retirees of each country. That means that their savings, their income can't support the pensions and the Social Security or whatever system each country has. So therefore, the pensions and the pensions have to invest in higher returning asset categories. So that's very important to be able to sustain the increasing number of retirees because people are having less kids and they're also living longer.
Right.
So the health costs and the retiree costs are going to continue to grow up.
Yeah.
Got it.
Can we touch on also that's I think great overall advice, tying back into finance also. But also I really wanted to get into giving back with the Julis Center and how that came about also. If you could tie that in.
How much time we have? Okay, we have about 5 minutes.
Perfect.
left.
Okay.
Great.
Give us 3 minutes on that.
Okay. So my approach to philanthropy is shifting, particularly since October 7th. So first of all, I owe a lot to the schools that educated me. So at Princeton and at Harvard, I have a debt of gratitude, which I think I participated in different ways. Our family has participated in different ways. And at Brown, where I'm on the board, I'll be on the board until May, where 2 of my 4 kids went. One who's graduating in May, and the other one already graduated. And 2 went to Princeton. So I have a 2-generation debt of gratitude to those institutions, Princeton and Harvard. Having said that, I would say that I am not happy with the governance of those institutions, and I think increasingly Jews are going to vote with their dollars and their feet to alternative schools. We've written about this in the Jewish Journal, and there are many articles about this in the Jewish Journal, Tablet, et cetera, et cetera. I think the most important institution in the Ivies to support today is Chabad's, because they're there.
On the ground, yeah.
They're on the ground. They're independent of the universities. They know how to usually operate pragmatically without giving up their value system. I'm not saying what people should do, but to me, if my kids were making choices, the choices I would think would be to schools in the South, Vanderbilt. I think Brown is still a healthy institution. It's going to go through challenges perhaps in the future, like all these schools, but Jewish life is strong there.
Right.
Jewish life is still strong at Harvard and Princeton. I'm just not in agreement with governance there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think that bodes well for the future unless it changes. So there are schools like Vanderbilt, there's schools in Florida, there's schools in Texas. SMU is going to get a Chabad.
Yeah, they are.
Wash U, you come from Dallas.
Right by SMU.
Yeah, Rabbi Drizzen. So
He's amazing.
to me, Chabad on campus is one of the most important things for
Right.
people to get behind, because they are there and they are going to provide the sanctuary or the home, the support, regardless of what happens at any institution. So that's number one. Number two, I believe that Yeshiva University, this is a plug, I'm on the board there, is an increasingly important institution that Jews should support. It is the most important modern Orthodox institution in the United States, and increasingly it is being very strategic under President Berman's leadership in terms of developing strategic alliances with other institutions that will, I think, be very good in terms of cross-pollinating with what those institutions that have similar values offer in terms of their resources.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to Israel, I think Israel is one of the most important things that we can support at this point, because look, Chabad has really made sure that the diaspora doesn't dissipate. So Chabad tries to take care of what's outside of Israel. But we as Jews, you'll have Chabad in Cusco, Peru, doing
Wherever you might find
Passover
yourself.
Seders for 2,000 people. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Cartagena, it's not just quite amazing.
I don't even know where that is on
But
that.
all of our Jews, all of us Jews need to support Israel in different ways. That doesn't mean we have to support the particular government or the particular prime minister, but without Israel, I think the Jewish life is going to be very, very lost, given what's going on.
Yeah.
And what we've seen come out of the Jew hatred and anti-Zionism
Right.
of October 7th. And this administration is very supportive of trying to roll that back, but, it's 4 years.
Right.
And what comes after that, you can't rely on. The only thing we can rely on is our, faith in the Almighty and the fact that we've gone through the ups and downs of different leaders.
And we're still standing.
And we're still standing, and that's because despite whatever differences we have, we need to come to an agreement that Jewish institutions and Israeli institutions need to be supported in a bigger way than ever before.
Yeah.
So that kind of solidifies and focuses where I think philanthropy should go. And I think increasingly people like Dan Loeb and Paul Singer and
Right.
others have understood that. Bill Ackman, they've understood it for a long time. I've learned from them in terms of what they're doing. And we're forming, and Mark Rowan from Apollo, all of us communicate with each other in different ways. And I think reaching out to other institutions, for example, at Yeshiva University, we have something in the Strauss Center called Restoring the American Story, the role of the Hebrew Bible in American history. That is our effort to provide an alternative to the 1619 project in K through 12 schools. My overall philosophy now also can be summed up as hugging and hitting. So I believe in lawfare. We're suing the LAUSD for the ethnic studies curriculum. So that's the hitting part. But you also have to hug. You have to build bridges and blow up bridges. You
like
have to
that.
figure out how to do that strategically.
Build bridges and
And
blow up
pick
buildings.
which battles to fight. Okay.
Absolutely.
Just Mitch, right before we let you go.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to say.
Yeah.
There's an article which I think in the Jewish Journal, which I have supported with David Suissa doing a great job, by a woman named Naya Lecht, who I think teaches at one of the Jewish day schools here. It's called From the River to the Campus, How the Arab-Israeli Conflict Was Shipped to the West While Casting the Jew as Villain, an Analysis and Response. I recommend all the people who are listening to this podcast get that article. Why? Because it really summarizes the danger that we're facing today in higher education and outside of higher education. What is that? It is the importing of the Middle East conflict within the construct of the civil rights movement in the United States. Why is that? Because of this whole area in academia of critical race theory, intersectionality, and colonialism and decolonization.
Victim prosecutor.
And basically, Israel is being taught at academic institutions without proper supervision from leadership, in my view, that Israel is the last gasp of white colonialism. And as a result, that all Jews are white colonialists. And therefore, it is fair to harass us, to put our lives in danger, to discriminate against us. And this is outrageous. It is an abdication of responsibility by university and college leadership. And again, accountability is important. And we'll see what happens with these Title VI efforts and also lawsuits that are being waged by Shabbos Kestenbaum and others. But this has been going on for years, and that is why I think it's important for Jews to, when they consider higher education for their kids and what institutions they're going to support, to take a hard look at whether or not governance at these universities and colleges is really understanding what is being taught in this way. And this article really brings it into clear focus.
Okay, be sure to check it out. It's From the River to the Campus by Naya Lecht. Definitely, everyone check it out. So, Mitch, just before we let you go, we like to ask this question to every guest before they go. What's one experience, skill, or trait that you've learned from the alternative asset management business in that area that you think applies to Jewish professionals across every industry?
This is something I learned when I took presidential power during the time that Nixon was imploding. It was a book by Richard Neustadt called Power of the Presidency. It's where you stand depends on where you sit. And so, the whole idea that the economy is generally efficient and, individuals engage in utility maximizing behavior, and that accounts for the way we see things in the economy and finance. And I think that human beings are social animals, and they get leverage by forming organizations and institutions, and it's the incentives and decision rules of those institutions that intermediate a lot of the behavior we see in the economy and the financial market. And that's why, for example, you could see, this is an idea of systems thinking. Most people are not evil. They're not bad people. They're just, the structure gives them certain incentives to engage in certain types of behavior, right? So when you look at system dynamics or systems thinking from that standpoint, you really try to find where the leverage points are to understand the underlying behavior. The same thing as the Harvard Negotiation Workshop, what it taught for many years. Don't look at people's positions, look at their underlying interests. Understand how they're being motivated. So to me, we see this in complex corporate restructurings these days. You really have to understand what the motivations are and then to get to a problem-solving situation. So where you stand depends on where you sit. I have a whole bunch of aphorisms that have come from investing. There's like the Woody Allen, 80% of life is showing up. Where you stand depends on where you sit. There's another one, nothing impedes like success. That as you grow significantly, there's always a problem. There's the idea of unintended consequences. One thing that I would point to, there's a link, we can give it to you later, of Robert Merton trying to explain how the LTCM situation blew up in 1998.
Okay.
And what he didn't understand was the feedback effect of taking on stupid leverage. It looked like it was intelligent leverage for his positions, but he didn't realize that the incentives of the financial institutions was to mark his positions down
Yep.
and drive collateral.
It's in the book. It's in
And,
the Credit Investor Handbook.
It is in the right.
Yep.
So his father came up with the idea of feedback and self-fulfilling prophecy. But yet he,
Right.
as the son, differentiating from his father, believed in efficient market for the most part, and the idea that pricing disequilibria would eventually converge, and that you could leverage that idea. Well, it doesn't work if your lender figures out a way to drain liquidity from you.
And then you're bankrupt.
And then you're back because you lack the staying power.
Right.
So staying power is a predicate to earnings power. That's another aphorism, you know.
We're ripe with so many of them.
Do you have
So
any,
there you go.
before we let you go, any final takeaways as a Jewish professional in the workplace for our audience?
Be proud, you know. I'm not saying that everybody should wear a kippah or a Star of David or, you know, hostage medallion or, you know, one of these things, these yellow ribbons, but there's no hiding. You need to be who you authentically are. And I think some people have written articles that say, you know, you should get more Jewy. You know, it's like really one of the ways to really understand what's going on in the world is to deepen your understanding of your heritage. Understand the values that underlie Judaism, how our history the history we've gone through that has tested our resolve and our relationship with the Almighty. That's our heritage. And understand that we have free will to chart our destiny. So, you know, you got history, you got values plus history is heritage. Heritage plus free will leads you to destiny. You'll need to have a system of thinking. You know, Ray Dalio has all his systems, right? He's on TV right now talking about how he approaches it. We have a system that's time tested. That system for making choices, given the free will we have, will allow us to have a good life. We just have to be educated, and we have to live that education. And we have to be, you know, have the courage to live that education.
That's amazing.
Mitch, thank you so much. I know you're a busy man, and we appreciate you taking the time.
Really
I got
appreciate
my
it.
mother to take.
Enjoy the show.
Right.
Enjoy the show. Enjoy your time in New York. Thanks
All right.
to our listeners.
Pleasure, guys.
Thanks to everyone for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks to Ashley, Josh, and JB for making the podcast. And of course, thank you to our listeners. You guys are the ones that drive it. So continue to give us feedback, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
And shout out Kwame Campbell for making the connection.
All right. Take care, guys.